Okay. Oop. Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Prince, for having me, and also to the Center for Asian Christianity for hosting this event. I'm glad to be able to join you via Zoom. But to be honest, I would love to join you in person in Australia, but instead I'm coming in from a cold 0 degrees Celsius Edinburgh morning in Edinburgh, Scotland. Technology can solve many of our problems today, but probably not the Scottish weather. So, well, that's nevertheless, I'm glad to be able to join you for your evening, my morning. It's worth saying at the outset that my own position, my own background as a scholar and as a Christian shapes how this talk will come about. It shapes how I'm addressing this topic. And as you can perhaps guess from my accent and has already been introduced, I'm not from Edinburgh, and I'm not from Australia, but I am a Chinese American, born and bred, Southern California. And for myself, I could say that much of my own personal sense of vocational calling is connected to a deep belief in God's love for the Chinese church. I've lived in China and participated and preached in various churches in the country, involved in different types of ministries, and you can imagine the different types of ministries that there may be within China. But also, I've, of course, lived outside of China as well. I've lived in the US, Canada, the UK, both England and Scotland. And if you don't think they're two different places, they are quite different, England and Scotland. And I've, in all these different areas, I've been involved in Chinese churches as well as mainstream non-Chinese churches. So this is, of course, my background. But as I said, much of my own sense of vocational and ministerial calling is driven by this deep love in China and Chinese church. And until recently, I've been continuing to travel to China. Recently, many people have not been able to travel because of the pandemic and the like. But I have continued to maintain various connections with communities there. For today's talk, we've picked a fairly basic title, The State of the Church in China. In itself, this is a huge topic, really, and I suspect that different people delivering this talk would approach it in different ways. And I hope that knowing a little of my background gives you a sense that I hope to offer a perspective that in one sense, I am an academic, and so I try to be academically critical about things, but also one that I am personally and spiritually sympathetic with. And so instead of a straightforward lecture, as probably in 7 o'clock in the evening for you is maybe not what you would like, we thought about having a little bit more informal kind of a talk. And so I decided that I'm going to give my lecture across 5 major questions. Okay, and these are the 5 questions that I have gotten recently and generally speaking in terms of Chinese Christianity. And I'm going to structure around the 5 questions, and as Dr. Prince mentioned, we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. If I don't answer one of your questions, feel free to send them off, even if it's not related, as long as it's related to Chinese Christianity and so forth, right? But I thought I'd talk about these 5 questions, and our time is short, but each of these 5 questions can be 5 lectures, I would say. But I'm going to try to skim the tops of the mountains, if you will. But I hope that these points of contact will help you and us, actually, to think through the church in China and how Christians can better think and pray and support Chinese Christians wherever we are in the world. Okay, so I'm going to count backwards. Question number 5. And this is the most basic question that I've gotten. I'll start with. When did Christianity first come to China? Okay, now, if we were in a classroom, I would actually make this a pop quiz, okay? But we're not in a classroom, but, you know, I like you to think about this question, you thought you were coming to a talk on the current state of the church, but I'm asking about the origins of the church, and I'll come back to why I start with this history question. But I'm a lecturer, so, you know, I like to lecture, and I like to have pop quizzes, you know, but I can't do it quite well on Zoom, but I would like you to think for a moment. I am not sharing my screen. Somebody asked if I'm sharing my screen. I am not sharing my screen, no. But you're able to see my screen, me okay? Yes? Okay, great. Yeah, so I like you to just take a moment and think for yourself, when did Christianity first arrive in China? Okay, just think for a moment. Think about the possibilities that you've read, perhaps, or heard of. When did Christianity first arrive in China? Okay, time's up. So, if this were a classroom, I would have you raise your hands and stuff. We could kind of do digital hands, but it's a little bit difficult to do that. Okay, why do I start with this question? When did Christianity come to China? Well, one time I was speaking to a British royal, okay, so a member of the royal family, and they were surprised, and I won't name whom, but they were surprised when they heard I researched Chinese Christianity. And the royal literally asked me, "There are Christians in China?" And I was kind of shocked. And I said, "Oh, okay." Perhaps that was something I said. But the royal asked me, there's Christians in China. I said, "Oh, yes." And the royal proceeded to ask me, have they been there for long? Which really took me aback. And part of the reason I was surprised is that most people are aware that Christianity may have had a major impact on China since at least the 1800s. Okay? Maybe some of you have thought the 1800s. Okay? And I would think that this royal would at least know Christianity was in China in the 1800s. Why? Because of British imperialism. Okay, so this royal, of course, is a part of the royal family, and the history of Britain and British relations with China is very much tied to the history of the Opium Wars, right? And Britain trying to sell opium to China and causing a war in China. And this actually was a very important time that opened up Christian mission to enter China. Many people remember the first Protestant missionary to China, which is Robert Morrison, right? And Robert Morrison, however, never really spent much time in what we would generally call mainland China. Okay, he basically lived in either Macau or this little part of this little port area just outside of Canton City, or what we may call today in Mandarin Guangzhou. Right, so he lived outside on the port. Okay, there were just a few miles of land that he could live in. And was either there or Macau. He never really entered China. Okay, and it wasn't until after Morrison's death that the Opium Wars opened up the possibility for missionaries to enter the mainland of China. But of course, 1800s was not the first encounter with Christianity that China had. And I suspect that some of you who are a little more aware may be familiar with the Jesuit mission in the 16th century. That's actually not the first Catholic mission, but most people are aware of the Jesuit mission, especially with Matteo Ricci, the Italian Jesuit. Of course, this is a Catholic mission, but also remember that Catholic mission in the 16th century started as a reaction to the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation in Europe was happening, and there was a loss of Catholics to Protestantism. And as such, there was a move for the Catholic Church to send missionaries around the world, and one of the places was Asia, and China in particular. But even this is not the earliest record of Christianity in China. Some people have pointed out 1400s. Not actually. 70 to 100. That's quite optimistic. Some rumors have it that St. Thomas made his way to China. We have no archaeological evidence of this. But the earliest archaeological proof we have is of 625 of Christians from the Church of the East, often known as Nestorians. I don't like using that word because that's often a bad word used labeling them as opposed to a word that they take for themselves. The Church of the East, which we're really coming from the Syrian-speaking parts of what we would call kind of like Middle East area right now, today. And I remember telling this royal that I was speaking to that Christians have been in China since the year 625 AD. Okay, 625 AD, and this royal they asked me, well, how did they get there? Of course, the answer was the Silk Road, right? And I told them this, that they traveled the Silk Road, to which the royal responded, they really do get around, don't they? And I wasn't sure if she meant. Oops, I said she. I wasn't sure if the person meant the Chinese or the Christians, but that's a different matter. But it was through the Silk Road, through traders along the Silk Road, that Christianity comes into China and actually makes headway all the way to the imperial court. Right? So this is actually quite significant. Now, I start with this question of why this is of when Christianity first came to China, because I think it's important on many fronts. First, it is to say that Christianity entered China in a very early time, 625. How early was this? This is basically around the same time that the Bishop of Rome was sending missionaries to this barbaric island to convert the Anglo-Saxons, okay, in the British Isles, basically, right? 596, okay, is the Gregorian mission to the Anglo-Saxons in Britannia, right? And so it's roughly in the same, 30 years apart, but it's roughly around contemporaneous to each other. But the history of Chinese Christianity, we have to realize that the history is a complex one, but it's as old as British Christianity. Chinese Christianity is as old as British Christianity. It has not, British Christianity, however, has made much more impact and headway than Chinese Christianity historically, but both events had Christianity entering into the imperial courts, but because of several waves of religious suppression in China, it has not made the same amount of headway, I think, as in the British equivalent. But secondly, I think it is telling that most people that I interact with, who have some familiarity with Christianity in China, think that Christians arrived primarily in the 1800s. And this is often the case even within China, that many in China think that Christians first arrived in the 1800s. And this is actually quite crucial, because unlike the 7th and the 16th century missions, which largely came through trade and cultural exchange, what we have in the 1800s is war. That we have different empires launching war within China. British, French, Russian, Japanese, American, all these different countries executing war upon China in the 1800s, leading to what is often termed the unequal treaties, all these various treaties. And I've highlighted 3 main treaties here in this slide, really to highlight the 3 treaties that opened up different avenues of mission, actually. The Treaty of Nanking, as it was called at the time, between the Brits and the Chinese, opened up the possibility for Protestant mission to come into China. And the Treaty of Wangpo, as it was called at the time, by the French, opened up Catholic missions. And the Treaty of Tianjin opened up, in particular, for the Russians. The Russian Orthodox Church wanted to have a mission. And they were afraid that the French and the British would change China into a Protestant or a Catholic country, so they wanted to send Orthodox missionaries. And so the Treaty of Tianjin in 1858 was multi-country, but the Russian version of the treaty explicitly opened up the possibility for Russian mission in China. Now, not all missionaries agreed with these developments of military force, but generally speaking, there was a basic belief for Christian missionaries at the time, especially Protestant missionaries, that this was part of God's hand in opening China to the gospel message. That military force was a part of God's hand. Now we could debate the whether or not that's right, that is a correct approach, but at the time this was the way that Christians were interpreting the situation. But what I think is particularly important about starting with this idea of this presupposition that the 1800s was when Christianity first came to China is that it is during this time that Christianity gets the name foreign religion. Okay, in Chinese, in Mandarin, it's pronounced Yangjiao. Okay, as a foreign religion. Okay, this term Yangjiao is a very odd term. Okay, if you're familiar with Chinese, it's an odd term because it's made up of 2 characters. The second character, Jiao, is teaching or religion. Okay, that's simple enough. The first one is an interesting character because it has the sound component of yang. Okay, but the side is water. Okay, and the point of this character is to point to the ocean. Okay, and this term Yangjiao is a new term that comes about in the 1800s. It's invented in the 1800s. It did not exist prior to this time. And the actual Chinese character itself implies that Christianity, which is the main Yangjiao, main foreign religion, okay, is something that came from outside, from the ocean, which is precisely how the Brits and later the French and Americans and other forms of imperialism entered China and brought Christianity by force on gunboats. And so I start with this slightly esoteric part of history, okay? Because today, if you read or listen to Chinese media, or the way Christianity in China is discussed, or in recent years under Xi Jinping, there's been this discussion of it's often translated the Sinicization of religion, or the Sinicization of Christianity. I actually don't like that translation because the Chinese phrase is 中国化. I think it's actually better translated something like Chinification or Chinization or something like that, because it's actually emphasizing a statist understanding of religion. Okay. Something that's bending towards the socialist agenda of the state. But I think one of the important things is that the point of Sinicization or Chinification, however you want to, not as sexy of a term, I know, but this term, however we term it, the point is that it is to shake off the foreignness, the Western infiltration. And this is a phrase, Western infiltration, you'll see in a lot of media discussions in particular, that Christianity needs to no longer be a foreign religion, but a Chinese religion, whatever that means. Right? And I think that this question of being a foreign religion is something that continues to plague the legacy and the continued understanding of Christianity today. And that's why I think, actually being aware of the longer history has something of importance in terms of the state of the church in China today. Okay, so that's the first question, okay, or the fifth question. Sorry, I'm going backwards in numbers. My fourth question, okay, the next one I'm going to look at is this. Are there basically two churches in China? Okay, this is what I'm often asked when people are aware, at least, that there are Christians in China. Are there not two churches in China? Now, when I get this question, it is usually not a question about are there Protestants and Catholics. Okay, that's kind of a accepted reality, but oftentimes, actually in Chinese, Protestant and Catholic are two completely different terms, and Christianity is almost always equated with Protestantism in Chinese language, and we can talk about why that's the case, but in any case. But most of the time, when I'm asked this question, aren't there basically two churches in China, it is often a question of the state-sanctioned Three Self patriotic movement and the so-called house churches. And this dichotomy of Three Self versus house church is often quite a popular and quite a well-used dichotomy, and is one that I find of many people speaking about it. Christianity in China, whether you're within China or outside of China, whether you're going to a Chinese church and familiar with Chinese Christians, or you are an academic, I've found this dichotomy between Three Self versus house church. And oftentimes, theologically, oftentimes people talk about the Three Self as being more liberal or modernist, and the house church as being more evangelical, or some people use the term fundamentalist, although today that term is often not favored as much. Or other people use this dichotomy to speak about the government church versus the true church, right? And that has certain implications by itself. I would say that I've visited many churches throughout China in different parts of the country, and I'll say that I've visited a number of Three Self churches in particular, and I find that and not only in my limited experience, but also what other scholars have said, that the vast majority of Christians in China, whether of Protestant Christians in China, whatever church they are part of, generally speaking, tend to be much more evangelical than even churches outside of China. They tend to lean towards a much more conservative bend in theology, and don't really understand or contest so much the distinction between the Three Self and the house church. And what do I mean by this? I think, first, to be clear, there is technically no such thing as a Three Self church. Okay? And this may sound a little bit odd. And in Chinese, oftentimes people will say 三自教会, the Three Self church, right? And this is very commonly used. But I think part of the thing that we have to realize is that the Three Self, or the Three Self patriotic movement, okay, as is the more official name, or the TSPM, was started in the 1950s as a parachurch organization. Okay, what do I mean by a parachurch organization? I mean, it's not a denomination. Okay, it's not something that has a particular theology, a particular polity. That's theologically we talk about polity, the way that church government is managed, right? There's no explicit confession that's tied to that church, okay? That you might have a Baptist confession or a Westminster confession or something like that, right? There's nothing that's necessarily tied to the Three Self patriotic movement. It's not a church. In the 1950s, when it came into existence, it was something that you said you were connected to in order to say that you were allied with the communist cause. It was not a denominational association. And in the 1980s, after the end of the Cultural Revolution, the TSPM became the main way that churches registered with the with the government to be legally recognized. So the TSPM is not a church in the sense that as a denomination and without an official theology. Likewise, the term house church is really a very loose term, because in China it originates during the Cultural Revolution period, this terminology, and it really refers to, in Chinese it's 家庭教会, it is the house, the home, right? Why? Because that's where people met, right? And how many people can you have in a home? Maybe optimistically in my home, maybe 20 people, and a couple small children maybe, but how many people can you have at home? And actually in the 1970s, if you think about it, in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, 76 of the Cultural Revolution, people are meeting in homes because they are trying to continue to preserve the faith in the midst of overt suppression from Red Guards and so forth of the Cultural Revolution. And so the origin of house church, this terminology, is really about meetings in homes, okay? And they're generally small gatherings in homes, historically. Now, in the 1980s, there was what is often termed a Christianity fever, 基督教热, that occurs throughout China. And this is a growth of Christianity in many parts of the country, but in particular in house churches, largely in rural settings, but also Christianity growing in urban settings. Firstly, in the TSPM registered churches, but eventually also in the growth of university campus ministries, right? So this is all happening in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And in reality, I would say, today, many the average Chinese Christian is probably not aware of much difference between the TSPM and the house church. Okay, some would happily float between the two. Others are much more rigid in saying, well, I've always gone to a house church, and the TSPM, I've heard things about it not being a true church, so I don't go there. Okay, but I think the average Chinese Christian is not aware of the differences in detail between the different entities, the different existences. And in particular, like I said, many Christians actually happily float between the two. And I know, personally, I know of a university professor who was the elder of one of fairly important unregistered church, and he happily went to the local government-sanctioned seminary and would teach in the seminary, and they knew his background and everything, but they were very happy to do that, very happy to have him teach there. And there are many government-sanctioned seminaries that I know of that also have official numbers of TSPM, authorized trainees, seminarians, but they also have an unofficial list of house church Christians that they are training up as well. And so the boundaries between these identities is a bit more blurry than we often assume. Now, one of the things that is actually very important to note is that, as I said, the term house church has its origins in the 1970s. But currently, and in the last, we're in 2022 right now, so in the last 2 decades, roughly, there has been kind of a shifts in what is understood as a house church. And I think in particular what was happening in the mid 2000s, the knots as they say, and into the 2010s, was a phenomenon in which networks of house churches, especially in urban centers, made a decision to join together and to meet as a whole. Right, so you imagine house churches, house church network with all these different meetings, let's say 20 to 40 people in each of these, and this network decides, well, we're going to meet together as one whole unit, forming large churches, some really large ones, in the thousands we're talking about. Okay, and they would have enough financial capital to be able to purchase or rent office buildings to hold church services and to have a much more visible presence, okay, than in the past. Now, one of the reasons for this was that in 2005, the government issued new regulations that opened up the possibility for churches to register with the government without using the TSPM as an intermediary. Okay, so if a church can register directly with the government without going through the TSPM, this changes the scenario, right? And this is quite important because, as the pastor of one church in Beijing put it, it allows churches to break the deadlock within the Chinese church between what he calls the illegal house churches and the adulterous TSPM, right? And for this this pastor, of course, his perspective is that we need to be not illegal, but at the moment the only way is through the TSPM to not be illegal, but then that would be to be adulterous, and we don't want to do that either. Right, so we need to break away from this deadlock between the illegal existence and an adulterous existence. And this provides a different possibility, a third way or a third church, as some people have described it. And so this third way or third church between the traditional house church and the TSPM registered churches. And in reality, the regulations that the government came out with didn't really have much impact. There was still a requirement that you had to be a TSPM trained pastor and all this stuff, that basically it didn't come to reality. So it was a regulation that didn't mean much when it came out. And actually, if we consider many of the unregistered churches that have been shut down by the government in the past decade or so, they're almost always associated with one of these big churches that were networks that formed together to create these larger churches. Probably the biggest names in the news have been Shouwang Church in Beijing in particular. Zion Church is another. Early Rain in Chengdu, All Nations in Shanghai. So all these various churches, which you can read about, various scholars, including myself, have written on these different churches. You could read about them, but they moved from a network view of house churches to trying to establish themselves as a larger entity, as a meeting together. And in part, this connects to my question number 3, which I've been asked many times. Is there now a Calvinism fever in China? Now, there's a lot of interest in this, partly because Calvinism is this kind of a interesting aspect of Christian history and Christian theology, and depending on where you are and in the world, you may have different opinions about Calvinism. It's had a comeback in the U.S. in different forms and so forth. But briefly, I would say that there are 2 major dimensions of these developments. First, we have to remember that the period of biggest growth in the Chinese church in recent decades happened in the 1980s. Much of this was very much at the grassroots level, and it spread because of a fervency in an evangelical revivalist type of a message, right? And as such, it was not very interested in theology, or shall I say dense theology, or theological debates. But when we move into the 1990s, what's happening in China is that there's the sprouting up of a lot of these, shall I say, Christianity-inspired religious movements. Groups like Eastern Lightning and the Shouters, okay? And these are groups that were shaped by the house church, but then kind of have a variance in their own theology, okay, that many would say is outside of the Orthodox tradition. But interestingly enough, the government bans these various religious movements. They call them 邪教, okay, which roughly speaking it means evil teaching, evil cult is sometimes how it's translated, okay? And this is an interesting label because to be a 邪教, this is actually has a long history in imperial history. I won't get into that, but this term 邪教, it basically means that if you are labeled as a 邪教, you can legally be oppressed by the government and arrested, and it is serious business if you are labeled as a 邪教. Okay, Falun Gong, for instance, is labeled as a 邪教in China today. Now, so you have these various groups that are being labeled as 邪教, but for many Christians, they wanted to clarify that they were not one of them, right? But in order to clarify that they are not one of them, they have to clarify what their theology was, and to show that they had some kind of an orthodox understanding of Christian theology that was not evil, was not Xie, right? And they wanted to distance themselves from these groups, and and many of them turned to Calvinism in particular. And there's a number of people who were traveling into China at this time. In particular, figures like Jonathan Chow, not related to myself, Chao, who was and Stephen Tong from Indonesia, Samuel Ling, and other sort of overseas Chinese Christians who were traveling into China and bringing especially a Calvinist version of Christianity, and trying to underscore the importance of theology and reason above subjective experiences and emotions. And so what is happening during this time in the 1990s in particular is a need for a stronger theology, and Calvinism becomes one of these answers. And it becomes very important. And, there's a retranslation of John Calvin's Institutes and all this interest in Calvinism in order to try to figure out one's theology and to clarify the way that we think about our faith, right? And it also offers supposed answers to how we are living Christianly in a secular society or a non-Christian society like China. But secondly, and I think this is an important connection to my last point or my last question, is that this is also connected to some of the third church, as I mentioned earlier. That there were many Chinese who became Christians after the 1989 Tiananmen Square democracy protests. You see, during the 1980s, in 1989, there were many students and young intellectuals who joined the protests because they wanted to transform Chinese society. But the clash left many disillusioned about the communist government. And so many converted to Christianity. And in particular, they looked towards Calvinism, especially a form of Calvinism which today we call Neo-Calvinism. Okay? And if you do a Google search for it, it's Neo, N-E-O, Calvinism, not New Calvinism, which is a slightly different but confusingly named similar term. Neo-Calvinism, which traces its history to the Dutch Reformed tradition. And actually at Brisbane School of Theology, Dr. Bruce Pass is a specialist in Neo-Calvinism. He did his PhD here in Edinburgh. That's how I know him and his research. But Neo-Calvinism becomes an important form of Calvinism for these intellectuals. Why? Because Neo-Calvinism has certain theological ideas which emphasize how the church can engage and transform the society and the state. And it gives them there's this language in Neo-Calvinism of the cultural mandate or common grace. And these are theological ideas that give a rationale for building up a civil society and engaging the state in dialogue that for many of these churches they find very important and valuable. And so this is why for these big churches in urban centers, they want to register. They want to create a third church so that the faith would not be simply limited to the home, in the home setting, if you will, quite literally, but have influence beyond the home, beyond the private arena and in the public arena, around society and legal matters and so forth. And actually many of these church leaders, the founding pastor for the early rain church in Chengdu, for instance, he was a human rights lawyer. So many of these church leaders were lawyers and were interested in affecting, changing the legal system within China, which is quite a high order if you ask me. But there's a theological rationale for this interest. And so I think it's important to understand why Calvinism became so important in China, because it not only shapes the discourse with relationship to the religious ecology of China, but also in terms of how the church is able to engage with the questions that are pressing the society at the time. Now, this kind of connects to, it kind of connects to my next question, my question number 2. So this is my last 2 questions here, and my question 2 is, how has the internet changed the Chinese church? And this might seem an odd question at first, but it's actually quite important, because if you think about what is happening in China, of course, China is tracking with what's happening around the world, right, with the internet and so forth, but in different ways, in a local form, right? And as China is evolving in terms of the different technologies that are being used, that evolves the way the church is being being practiced, and Christianity is being practiced. And it's perhaps this question I get much more nowadays since the pandemic, because everybody's on Zoom these days, and we have to think about probably in Australia as much as in Edinburgh, we've had to consider, how do we do online church, and what does that mean, and so forth. But China's an interesting place, right? Because not only has China advanced in digital technology as well as everybody else, and has had the internet as well as everyone else, and actually is the place where much of our technology is either manufactured or designed, or somehow China has plays a role in the technological evolution of the world, if you will. But also, China has the most sophisticated censorship system in the world. Okay, what is often termed the Great Firewall of China. And if you've ever traveled to China, you'll realize that Facebook doesn't work all of a sudden, or Twitter or Instagram or whatever else you use to connect with people. It doesn't quite work as well. And Google doesn't quite work, and you can't Wikipedia things anymore. All this information seems to be blocked. And why is this? It's because of the Great Firewall of China. Now, Christians, I would say, have tried to negotiate these technological advances in different ways, and many have continued to use things like WeChat and Zoom for Christian activities, and indeed, even in the height of the pandemic, as 2019, it started in China, of course, in 2019 and into 2020, the Chinese government was encouraging people, and Christians in particular, to go online, right? Because they don't want people to meet face to face. And so this encouragement of more and more digital usage. But what you have also is you have not only the use of different technologies, but also the crackdown, the censorship of the usage of WeChat or websites and different blogging tools. And so many churches would host websites outside of China, Okay, and using technologies like VPN to circumvent the Great Firewall of China, so that they are able to post things without being having their content removed or shut down by government censors. But of course, much of this is happening as a cat and mouse chase between how Chinese Christians use technologies and they're caught and have to adapt. And VPN, if you know anything about VPN in China, it's something that's kind of an ambiguous technology and it's probably illegal to use technically, but you know, at the same time, a lot of businesses have to use it for business purposes. And so there's this, it's kind of this odd space of VPN. And so we have to remember that online religious activities is really a gray area because it represents religion outside the confines of a physical space. And that's where I'm kind of raising the question, right? It's, if you can't meet as a large church, can you meet outside of a physical space, right? And many of these churches that have been shut down in terms of their physical meetings have shifted to online. And really the religion online is a gray area. And this is why, you know, some people have highlighted in particular in the last couple years, you know, now you can't buy Bibles on, you know, China Amazon, for instance, right? And some people will say, oh, now there's this crackdown on the sale of Bibles. Actually, technically, it was never legal to sell Bibles unless you are associated with a self-registered entity. Okay, so if you're buying a Bible from a bookshop, you know, down the street or on Amazon, it's technically already illegal. Okay, because you have to buy it from a registered entity. Okay, and so it was never legal. The government just caught up to this reality that people were trying to skirt the law online. And just last week, if you're up with the news, on March 1st came into effect the new government policy that was measures on the administration of internet religious information services. And this basically underscores the point that only registered entities can lawfully publish or broadcast religious information and activities through the internet. You can take a look at, actually Christianity Today just did a quick article on this a couple of days ago. Check it out on Christianity Today. But what I think is really interesting about this article is that it interviews a number of pastors and stuff, and the response is actually pretty much what I would have expected. It is that Chinese Christians see the benefits of online ministry, and although they need to be more shrewd digitally, it's basically business as usual. Basically, you continue to be careful and use ways to kind of work around the system. So I think technology has really opened up new questions and very different questions for us. And I'm going to end, I see I have 1 minute left, or on my clock 40 seconds left. I think I'm going to go over by just a couple of minutes. I apologize for that.
You got the freedom to go longer, my brother.
Oh, excellent. I'm going another hour then. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going in another hour. Just a few more minutes over. And I see a question that's come up already that anticipates my last question, which is one that is on many people's minds. What is the relationship between the church in China and global Chinese Christianity, or the global church for that matter? And I think the digital question actually points to this different and related question, because it is about Chinese Christianity that is beyond the limits of physical boundaries. And and I think one of the things that we've seen, especially with a number of churches being shut down in China, is that many Chinese Christian leaders and Chinese Christians have left mainland China and sought exile, especially in the US, and other countries in the world, and perhaps in Australia as well. But there's also, as many people are aware, the political situation in Hong Kong that has led to an additional exodus coming from Hong Kong. And in particular, the UK, living in the UK, I have felt this firsthand. Of my various contacts of Chinese churches throughout the UK, many of them have told me that their Chinese congregations, the Cantonese-speaking parts of their Chinese congregations, have doubled or tripled in sizes in the last year alone of Cantonese speakers. But this has also led to a shift in the Mandarin speakers in Chinese churches in the UK as well as elsewhere, because it implies that language implies political alliance. Implies. I'm not saying it is equivalent, but it implies political alliance and cultural differences between Hong Kong and mainland China. But also, I should say that the Russian-Ukraine war has raised questions for people in Taiwan. And Christians in Taiwan are split on the question of what is the relationship between China and Taiwan. And is China going to do the same thing as Russia? This is a question that many people have and are wondering. I don't really have an answer to. I'm not a prophet in that sense. But I think what I think is that this all has repercussions on Chinese Christians in Western contexts, like in Australia or in the UK. In particular, I have a picture here of one of the oldest Chinese churches in the UK, in Liverpool. And we have not only the effects of Chinese churches, but also the mainstream churches that are not Chinese dominant. And the impact is quite great, I think. That actually, when we think about Chinese churches in particular, I think Chinese churches in the West, I think we have to appreciate that they are not monolithic. That they are made up of Chinese Christians of all different immigration populations and different generations, later generations of English-speaking youth and so forth. And these multiple ways of immigration, and a lot of this due to different developments of government policies, local government policies and immigration policies, and the various languages, not only English and Mandarin and Cantonese, but also languages like Toisan and Hakka and Hokkien and all these different linguistic cultural realities of the global Chinese church. That is a very diverse church. And the geopolitics of what is happening in China and in Asia more broadly has impact on global Chinese Christianity and the global church indeed. By way of conclusion, I'd like to mention a slight elephant in the room. I have not had a bullet point on religious suppression. Okay, and the eagle eye of you will notice this. I've not explicitly discussed this, even though it's a very important question, and as you'll notice, it kind of pops up in each of my various points. But I think it's important to recognize that in Western societies, oftentimes we are privileged to the point of indifference when it comes to our freedom to live and practice Christianity. But in Western societies, we have certain political emphases, in part infused by Christian values that underscore freedom to believe and practice whatever we wish. This is a luxury that Christians in China have never known. In the West, we don't really understand the gravity of what Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, when Christ calls a person, he bids them come and die. And I'd like to just end with this last slide. In the 1950s, after the establishment of the People's Republic in China and the formation of the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, the pastor Wang Mingdao from Beijing, he made an interesting observation in Acts chapter 7 in the martyrdom of Stephen, where he notices that Christ is not sitting at the right hand of God. As you find in all other passages of Jesus beside God, he's not sitting, but he's standing. And in 1953, Wang Mingdao says, it is significant that when the disciples of Christ bravely witness for his name and his word, suffer humiliation and attack, persecution and death, even the Christ who sits at the right hand of God takes note and stands up from his seat, expressing respect and welcome to them. What a glorious thing to contemplate. In this amazing statement, Wang speaks about what Christ offers Christians who are persecuted to the point of death. And echoing Chinese sensibilities, it was a statement that the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, rewards faithfulness with honor and respect. Shortly after this statement, he was imprisoned for 15 years for not joining the TSPM. He was released later on in 1980, but recognized by many house church leaders as a major patriarch of the house church movement. I would say there's aspects of Wang Mingdao's theology that I disagree with, generally speaking, but there's a lot that I really appreciate of what he says. He represents one of many perspectives in China, then and now. But I think Chinese Christians like Wang underscore that suffering is part and parcel with the Christian faith, and that there is spiritual value behind upholding the faith in the face of adversity. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight injustices or flee oppressors. What it does do is it offers us a perspective, a different perspective, on what we should value as Christians, whatever our situation. And it points also to the bigger question of how we are to learn from the Chinese church for the world church. I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. You've certainly well and truly earned a drink or something there, where you can pause for a moment, catch your breath. You certainly raised for us 5 that's important but quite interesting and diverse questions, and appreciate that. They didn't just go down one line, but even picking up things about has the internet changed the Chinese church? That's a question I myself have not even thought about. Question about Calvinism. Obviously, the basically 2 churches in China is obviously a significant one. And certainly plays itself out in the literature, both published and sort of Christian commentary as well. So thank you for addressing that in some depth. But certainly, a number of questions have been raised here, and might actually maybe start with Linda's question first, or the last question. That from your perspective, is there still a place for foreign missionaries to actually move and minister in China? Do you have any particular thoughts on that question, Dr. Chow?
Yeah, I think that's a really important and pregnant question, actually. I think my simple answer would be yes. There is definitely a place. The question is what place, what role, and I think I apologize. I always start from. I have a historical bend in terms of how I answer contemporary questions, but 100 years ago, 112 years ago, In this city of Edinburgh, actually next door to my office, it was the Great World Missionary Conference of Edinburgh 1910. And a Chinese pastor came to this conference, about 2,000 missionaries at this conference, about just shy of 20 non-Westerners at this conference. This one Chinese pastor, Cheng Jingyi, was at the conference, and he basically goes up and he addresses the 2,000 delegates and says, we love what foreign Christians have done in China. We want a united church. We want to have a church that's not divided based on your denominations. And he went back to China and he started the Church of Christ in China. 中华基督教会 is what it's called in Chinese. And it was an attempt to bring together churches in union. Now, some people attack that church as not holding up to certain theological orthodoxies and so forth, which I think is fine. But I think the general sentiment that Cheng Jingyi had, which I think continues to exist today, is yes, come, yes, bring your support, yes, please help us, but don't do it at the cost of dividing us. Don't bring it at the cost of recreating a Western church here, because at the time, in 1910, there was every major denomination you can imagine was there in China, right? And actually, many denominations actually had what we call committee agreements. Presbyterians over there, Anglicans over here. We don't cross lines, so we divide up, the territory into different existences of where the mission can happen. Well, then you have different Christians, Chinese Christians, saying, "Well, do I need to be baptized by submersion or sprinkling? Okay, and Sabbatarians, Seventh-day Adventists would be there as well. It's like, well, do I worship on Saturdays or Sundays? Then what are the dividing points, right? And I think it's natural for us to have our own biases, but I think if I could take some liberties here, I think the role of foreign Christians, the role of foreign missionaries is always one that is incarnational. It is always one that is modeled after Christ, that becomes flesh in that environment, in that context, and sheds the privileges of where you're coming from. And I think that's a taller order than people realize. So yes, I think there is a place. It's a question of what and where you see yourself, whether or not you realize it actually, because oftentimes there's a lot of privileges that come that are not as obvious, and at the same time, many Chinese Christians want to be Western. And there's this great, sorry, this is a distraction, but there's this great little academic article that says "Saved in McDonald's," lost in the market, saved in McDonald's, and it's an academic piece that talks about how many Chinese Christians out of the Tiananmen Square era were lost in the market economy and found salvation literally in McDonald's, meeting a Christian and seeing this draw of a Western picture of Christianity. And so I think there is a draw there, but at the same time, I think we need to be careful with that imposition and that bias.
Thank you very much, my brother. The question here David sends through about pastoral training. Do you have any sort of comments regarding where pastors actually train? And again, I'm conscious of not trying to create a dichotomy of three-self and house church, but there may be some
Sure.
differences or nuances there.
Yeah, I mean, strictly speaking, there are, in terms of state-sanctioned training grounds, there's 18, if I'm not mistaken, throughout China, which is, if you think of the number of Chinese Christians, that's not enough. And every one of those seminaries will tell you, and Bible colleges will tell you, it's not enough for them. But that is what the government has allowed. Many of those would, as I mentioned earlier, have sort of officialists and unofficialists of trainees there. But I think many, in terms of unregistered churches, church leaders, many are trained through unregistered seminaries, Bible colleges, training schools in China. Many will travel outside, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, Australia, UK, US, because of the interest in Calvinism. There's a number that are training in Calvinist institutions in North America, in particular, like Westminster, for instance, and elsewhere. So yeah, it's a variety of places, and it's not always encouraged, of course, by the government, but yes, people find ways to be trained.
Thank you. And the question here for us in Australia, particularly since the Tiananmen Square, we had quite a wave of immigrants from Hong Kong, and with what seems to be increased government crackdown in the last few years, and with what's happening in Hong Kong now and the political situation and its sort of future, should we be, I guess, as churches preparing, this is Alex's question, for another wave of immigration Hong Kong?
From my vantage point in the UK, it has already come. So not only should we be preparing, we should have been prepared. Because in the UK, I mean, I'm attending a Chinese church here in Edinburgh, and we've had some significant changes in the demographic of our population, specifically because of Hong Kong immigration. I mean, obviously, the UK has a slightly different relationship with Hong Kong versus Australia, even though Australia is closer and nicer climate, perhaps. In the UK, the UK government created a specific route to access a visa through the B&O passport. So if you're a B&O passport holder, you could transition. And so people have been transitioning over. It was around this time last year that the law came into effect, but people were actually coming over even before that. I mean, I was literally just yesterday, I was like at a cafe shop, and the cafe shop person behind, the counter was, came over from Hong Kong just earlier in the year, last year. And we were just talking about her transition and, the difficulties that she's been encountering of schooling and all these different things. So yes, it's definitely a shift. And it's, I think, probably in terms of Australia and the UK have similar kind of immigration patterns in terms of Hong Kong immigration, and I think in many respects the new wave of Hong Kong immigration is quite different from earlier waves of Hong Kong immigration, and I think that's one of these like subtle things that you don't really realize. Because well, for one thing, you have a distance of several decades, right? And no place is static. Hong Kong has evolved in the last since '97, there's different groups of people who are migrating as well, different parts of society, and for different reasons and different job opportunities as well. So it has tremendous impact, and I think even here in the UK, there's lots of efforts for churches to try to figure out how to navigate this, but it's one that I think is going to have significant impact for a long run, and not only positive ones. I would say I think there will be societal impacts that are I think the pandemic has opened up a very negative aspect of certain Western societies, and I'm not sure in Australia, but in the UK and in the US, there's been a lot of during the pandemic, a lot of anti-Chinese racism, and the UK has shifted from leaving the EU so that the UK can stand on its own, and then all of a sudden there's this influx of immigrants, and different immigrants also, right? But the Hong Kong immigrants in particular are going to take jobs that people want, and that's going to have some repercussions on society, I think. Yeah.
Very thoughtful response, brother. Because I'm sort of conscious of time. We've only got you for another 10 minutes or so, so we've got to try and make the most of it, and we've got one more questions coming in, but certainly one which I think is on all our hearts that comes in from Chris regarding how can the global church best partner with the Chinese church? And we're sort of sitting here in our comfortable air-conditioned in our place, maybe central heating your place, environments. We're not there in China. Any, I guess, initial thoughts to help guide us?
I mean, that's a great and pregnant question by itself. Yeah, I'm not sure I could do justice to it, but I would say though that on the one hand, it is what has happened. Part of what we need to be thinking about is what is happening in China itself and the evolution of Christianity in China, and even the growth in China of a really strong interest in China being a mission sending country. Okay, so I think there's that component there, but also a recognition that China has for a very long time been a missionary generating country. We may not have always understood this as a case, but it has for since the 19th century, since the 1800s, there have been Chinese missionaries going to Korea in particular, and throughout Southeast Asia and Asia, and broadly speaking, Chinese Christians traveling to the UK and speaking at different conferences in the UK. And so I think it's to recognize that there is a powerful that the church in China has already been long involved in the Great Commission, and is in part to recognize that, but it is also, I think the second part is to, and is what I suggested with my first question, which is my last one, of that has impact in terms of how we understand the church in the West, Chinese Christians in the West. The long and short of it is that many Chinese churches exist in the West because mainstream Western churches did not minister to Chinese when they came, and I've seen this historically in the U.S., in Canada, in the U.K., and in Australia. Of what I've read of Chinese immigration in Australia, that Chinese churches have often started because the mainstream churches have forsaken their duty to those who are in their midst. And I think that's a sober point to raise, perhaps. But I think it is constantly trying to think about how we are supposed to be involved in all who come in our midst, not only Chinese, but yeah, in terms of this question, definitely so.
Thank you. Liza sort of asked a question here, picking up, because in your sort of question number 4, you talked to a second about the different type of churches in China, and you sort of mentioned not just the three self and the house church, but also this sort of emerging third type of church. And she asked, do they all have sound teaching theologically, but the second was sort of, if you could only go to one, is there one that you would pick out? Maybe I can adopt that, for us in our ministries, even here in Australia or New Zealand, as someone's coming, when we have maybe Chinese university students become Christians and then they return to China, how do we direct them, any thoughts on that? That may end up being the last question.
That's the last question that I don't have an answer to. That's a really hard one to answer. I mean, I think the reality, I think, is that if you don't know churches on the ground in China, I mean, if you know churches in China on the ground, then you can point people to those churches. That's a simple one. But I think the more complex and more important point is those who become Christians outside of China should be discipled to know how to discern, to know how to navigate these questions. That's a tall order if you don't know much about China and you're trying to train somebody else. But I think I think one of the my predecessor to the person who founded the Center for the Study of World Christianity that I'm co-director for, who passed away last year, Andrew Walls, very important missiologist and scholar of African Christianity. He said at one point that that missionaries emphasize the transmission of the datum of theology, but not the ways of thinking theologically. That's a paraphrase, but in other words, they were trying to communicate what you need to know to be a Christian, as opposed to communicating how to think as a Christian. And for him, he saw that as a huge tragedy. And I think that's probably the something that we need to really be mindful of. That as people outside of China, Chinese outside of China become Christians, it is to nurture them and to know how to discern and to know how to navigate these types of questions, however they may be faced with as they return.
Well, Dr. Chow, you've been incredibly generous with your time. We're not going to take any more advantage of that. I hope we may have the opportunity in the future to have you speak to us again, because the Chinese church is not going to go away, and it's increasingly important on the world stage. But thank you for your generosity in sharing with us, and it's been a great privilege to have you. Friends, with our Centre for Asian Christianity, I've put some details there. Please connect on our website, resources, I'm trusting with the recording. I'll remember to record it, that we will be able to put this up, so you'll be able to watch that again, and plenty of other resources there as well. But thank you again for blessing us